Now, what I'm going to do really is to talk to you about the fantastic social change that we are all facing in terms of an ageing society, but try to, I suppose, address your question, which is, has the government really failed to address that, and if so, why? I came to this when I was doing stuff, I suppose, about 5 or 6 years or so ago, when it seemed to me that if you looked forward to 2020, it was bound to be the case that a significant ageing society was going to raise a whole range of big public policy questions and challenges. We had a first go at that and didn't get very far. So what I then had a go at was persuading the House of Lords, which usually takes about 10 years to do anything, persuading them that we should have an ad hoc committee to look at this issue. And so they didn't spot the trap. I gave it a really boring title, like Public Services and Demographic Change, but it was really looking at ageing and whether we're prepared for it or not. We then had, this is a bit of internal stuff, but it was probably relevant. We then had, I think, an absolutely first-class committee of heavyweight politicians and public servants, really big people, household names, many of them, who worked together on a completely cross-party basis very, very seriously. And as ever, we produced a unanimous report. Now, I'll tell you, first of all, the analytic of what we found and why I think that stacks up the case, the argument that government and society and we as individuals have not yet faced up to the implications of this big social change. But I'll also do a critique, probably fairly directly, of how government has seriously failed to respond to what most people accepted was a very accurate, correct statement and analytic of the issues. So why, 18 months before an election, did government try to bury it? You can provide the answer yourself, can't you? But we'll come back to that in a minute. What I'll do initially is I'll give you a few statistics so you can nod off if that's not your thing. And then I'll probably talk about 3 or 4 of the main challenges that we identified. There are 2 trends which are separate, which combined create this ageing society. The first, as you well know, is the success of medical science, which is by and large keeping many of us alive when we would otherwise have died earlier. So we see it in our family, we see it in ourselves, that we live with things that previously would have killed us, and with luck we live a good enough life for many years. So individual average lives are getting longer, as you well know. The second factor, again you know, was that after the Second World War there was a major baby boom. Not unique to Britain, many societies had that. You put those 2 forces together and they combined create a very significant increase in older population. I'll just give you the data very briefly. I'll use as an illustration 85 plus. You can use 65 plus depending on any other measures, but this decade alone the number of people 85 plus will increase by 40% nearly. To me, that is a major social change by itself. If you look at this decade and next decade, the number of people aged 85 plus will double. Again, quite a phenomenal big shift of our older population. And if you look at the 65 pluses, they do that also. They're not quite as dramatic, but there's still a very substantial increase in our older population. And then you look at the other end of the pitch. I've got a delightful granddaughter called Freya, who was giving me hell this morning first thing. And the odds of her not living to be 100 are quite slim. In other words, girls born, 50% of girls in the UK will live more than 97 years old, of babies born now. And so, given, middle class, healthy diet, cycles to school, all that, she's bound to have a better chance than the average. And I think that, just expresses it. You would have thought if you said, what's the age of a girl likely to live? If we'd said that 20 years ago, you said, well, if they're lucky 80 or so, it's going to be 100. Quite remarkable. So this, we must say it, first of all, is potentially a fantastic gift. You know, I might even read Proust, I might even learn a foreign language, I might see a few more countries, and I might learn to do gardening a bit better, you know, because I will have 10 more years, if I'm lucky, longer than I otherwise would have done. And that's true for many of us, but not all. But it doesn't come for free in lots of ways. And so, in a sense, the first question is, if many of us, are going to live another 10 years longer, who's going to pay for that? How are we going to support that, both in income terms, and how are we going to support it in terms of it being a decent quality of life? And I'll get rapidly into some of the boring stuff and hope Patricia Hollis is not listening at this stage in case she challenges me later. But what we basically said was, and we said quite a number of tough things, that the government had been right to raise the pension age, and we're going to have to raise the pension age again further than they currently said, almost for fundamental fiscal reasons, and also because you can't really stack up an argument that if you're going to live to 95, you're going to stop at 65 unless you're very lucky and very wealthy. Individuals won't by themselves necessarily be able to afford to live 30 years if the savings and assets they've got would previously have only supported a life of 15 or 20. So we clearly marked, as you well know, that many people are unsighted on how long they'll live. They're unsighted and underprepared about how they're going to fund that themselves. Really cheerful stuff. We then said, this is, you can see how we got applauded in the streets. We then said that many people are going to want to or need to work longer. And there's a bit of a problem. There's a problem on both the supply and demand side. On the supply side, we had that cult. Do you remember The Good Life, the film? You know, the Good Life was to try to sort of end at 55 and go off to the south of France or something and do nothing. That world is clearly gone. Many people now will need to work longer, partly because they will actually need to supplant the income that they've got from a pension base which is too thin. But employers are not there. Employers basically, by and large, have shown through the abolition of the default retirement age they'd like to have got rid of people as quickly as possible. So I've had some really challenging conversations with the CBI who don't as yet want to know that they've got to change their attitudes to older people and to flexible working, as the Finns have done. So both on the supply and demand side, they've made later working flexibly. You know, you don't want to work 50 hours a week, but you might want to work 10 or 15. So longer working. Pension reforms, again, I can't go into detail, but we basically said what you will know. Massive undersaving problem, or people are saving for the wrong thing, the level of pension provision for many people. For our generation, we're probably the last ones that are lucky, because many of us have got decent workplace pensions or defined benefit pensions, or even final salary defined benefit pensions. But that is not going to be the future for most people, and many who haven't got that, if they're living longer, are seriously exposed. So very significant undersaving problem combined with the British model of pensions, neither compulsory taxation, nor compulsory employers' pensions. And employers, by and large, have sought to exit from pensions, either defined benefits or pensions altogether, if they can, to reduce their labour costs. So individuals have increasingly become exposed. And you talk to 20 or 30-year-olds in their position, they don't worry about pensions because they can't bear the thought that they'll ever be old, can you? But if you think about what their position is going to be if they don't have some sort of focus on this. And the last thing we said on the income side of it was you've got the strange situation that about 75% of our current people, 65 plus, own their own house for a whole variety of reasons, not least Mrs. Thatcher. But so there's a lot of people who have got some assets in their house, but are often quite cash pinched. And one of the connecting issues we found was the complete absence of really a government strategy to help people get a supply market going on housing sufficient so they can downsize to the sort of accommodation they wanted to, get a better sort of accommodation and release assets at the same time. That really is not part of government thinking, let alone trying to make equity release work effectively. I think I'm going to have to accelerate because I'm taking much too long, I think, even on the first bit. So really big challenges around how we individually, and what we were saying, we need to have a conversation with the public about all this, and also we need to recognise that the current pension product which is on offer, defined contributions, is an absolutely dreadful product. You're invited to put a lot of money into a pot, and when you ask them what do I get for it, they say, oh, we can't tell you. You have no idea what you're getting for what you sacrifice, and most of us don't think that's a very attractive commercial proposition. Let's look at the sunny subject of health and social care. When we, I'll give you the bottom line. The bottom line is that we have got fundamentally the wrong NHS for an ageing population. We're going to have massively increased demand on NHS and social care, and that's going to cost, putting it very politely, a bob or two more to finance. The expert evidence, and we've got fantastic evidence for us, the expert evidence on the model was incredibly clear, and Charles and I bear some of the responsibility for this, because when the Labour government did what it had to do, which was really pump funding into the NHS, we funded it into the traditional model, which was by and large a hospital-centric, acute model of care, where, because of what I talked about previously, the model of care that we need for an ageing population is essentially helping people to manage long-term conditions better in the community, in their homes, without going into hospital. So all of the experts, now it's in our report, I can't give it justice briefly, will accept that we've got almost a smokestack NHS, which has got to be transformed into a very different model of care to support people independently in the community. You'll know about some of this. When we put that to Jeremy Hunt and said, do you agree with this? Yes, yes, yes. How are you going to make it happen? 1,000 flowers will bloom, was basically the answer. And we said, well, yes, we can believe that too much top-downism is a bad thing, and we can believe that you do actually want to liberate local commissioners to do something, but don't you think a little bit of a shove will be needed from the top? Watch this space. Clearly it's a developing space. People like Norman Lamb, I think, very thoughtful. So what I'm really saying on that is that most experts agree we've got the wrong model. The speed with which the NHS can change its model is glacial for a whole variety of reasons, and it will require political leadership, and that's in short supply on some of this stuff at present. Increased demand. I think the most shocking thing we found, and I still can't quite believe it, was when we asked the Department of Health, you know the numbers of the increased population, you know the numbers of the increased older population. We know this remarkably precisely, at least for public policy terms. We've got a very clear view of how many people will have at different ages in 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time. So we said, what's your demand forecasting consequent on that increase in older population? And they hadn't got any. And they said they'd had a go at it one time, but they'd never completed it, and they'd never published it. And they've still not published it at all. Now, for most of us, if you know you've got an increase in demand, you have to have some attempt at modelling what that might look like, and you can't get it exactly right. We had to then go to a good academic. Where else would one go? We went to a good academic called Carol Jagger, who's one of the most respected epidemiologists. I can't normally say that. And we basically said, take the 5 main long-term conditions, coronary heart disease, diabetes, dementia, the things that last a long time and cause all sorts of misery. Take the top 5 and give us your forecast, your best academic forecast of the increase there will be. And for these purposes, our focus was 2020 to 2030. Near enough to be real, but far enough to be able to give you a sense of the trends. And the lowest increase in that period, from 2010 to 2030, which I think was for diabetes, was 45%, and the top one was 80%. So an 80% increase in demand for one of the 5 main long-term conditions. When we looked at the figures for the increase in demand for relatively serious social care, the figure was 90%. And it's happening now. And this is what I'm saying to politicians of all parties currently. The fact that I talk about 2030, it's happening in this decade now. And you can see some of the rising demand pressures on the NHS happening at this point in time. So that was a bit shocking to find that there had not been any public estimation of the increased demand. The fun for the NHS and the fun for all of us is that we're asking the NHS, the third bit is the cost, of course. Long-term conditions, Department of Health estimate, drive 70% of NHS costs. So if you're going to get a very big increase in long-term conditions, what's going to happen to our costs? And again, nobody has done the numbers properly. The nearest we've got to it is Institute of Fiscal Study, just applying the historical trend rate of 40% in real terms per annum, which is what the NHS has consumed for the last 20 or 30 years, to what will be the funding gap by 21-22, assuming that the Nicholson challenge is not fully met, and it won't be fully met. And they came out with a figure of between 34, at the most optimistic, and 54 billion funding gap on a base of about 104 by 21-22. So this is the sort of stuff you're not allowed to talk about in church, if you know what I mean. But the limited evidence we've got is that there is a phenomenal increase in both demand and cost going to hit the NHS. Interestingly, we put all this in the report, and government didn't land a punch on us in terms of these judgments. NHS England said they completely concur in private with the judgments. So we've not made it up on the bus, if you know what I mean. Nobody's got precise figures, but the analytic that we broadly did and the direction of travel, they basically said, yes, this is an accurate description, both of where the system is wrong and an accurate system of the demand and the cost consequences. So that's cheered you up, hasn't it? And the challenge, of course, is you've got those three challenges at once. How you reshape a system which is facing very significantly increased demand, and at the same time it's begging for very increased funding, and of course we'll always get the funding later. And that's not a simple set of changes to make all at once if you've managed any changes. And I describe it as almost an existential challenge to the NHS. Feeling cheerful enough? Shall we go on a bit? A bit of the report, which I think is really interesting, and there's no simple answers to it, and it's not sort of crude media stuff, is when you look at the issue of fairness and ageing. The first bit, as a male, you won't be surprised if you're a woman to realise, is that I was surprised when I realised how different the experience of ageing was for women than it is for men. Not really time to do it, but often much more exposed financially, often the carer rather than the cared, often living by themselves, often poorer. So the thought that men and women is all equal, therefore they'll live equal lives. Women's experiences of age, of later life, very, very different on average from men's. And men's do even worse things. They'll take out an annuity on a single life, leaving the wife to cope somehow when they've popped it. So clearly, big issues to think about in terms of how we address gender fairness in later life. You know the social class stuff, and I won't go into it, but it's been done to death previously that if you live in Kensington and Chelsea, you'll live 10 years longer than if you live in Tower Hamlets. Even within a short geographical distance, phenomenal differences in longevity differences, and even more in healthy long life expectancy. So really, really big diversions. And then the stuff that, there's only about 3 students here, so we're safe, aren't we? We can just say it. The issue about intergenerational fairness and how you cope with all of this lot. And the point about intergenerational fairness is that our welfare model has always rightly basically been built, I'm putting it crudely, on the principle that you pay in by and large when you're young. You get some benefits of schools and a bit of university, you tread there carefully. But you get a bit of benefit when you're young, but by and large you get your protection later on in life when you need a pension, you can't work any longer, and you need health, and you might need a bit of social care if you couldn't afford it yourself. By and large, that was the model that Beveridge gave us, and that's how it's worked. So in a sense, you fund it when you're young, and you benefit when you're older. The question is obvious to you, is that if, because of our shifting population structure, we have got very, very many more older people, and the working age population proportionately is substantially smaller in ratio, that model will come under tension. It won't suddenly collapse, but clearly if the assumption is by and large that the working age population funds the older costs, and the older costs are going through the roof, but the number of the working age population is smaller, you've got some challenges. Now, it doesn't say it's impossible, but there are some challenges, and some of the stuff I'm doing to all of the, both to John Cruddas or Oliver Letwin or David Laws, and saying, you've got to face up this stuff. It's going to hit you on the nose very, very significantly. So how we fund this stuff, and what that then says, not just to trivial issues about, free bus passes or not, but how you fund much bigger issues about that scale of increase in health and social care costs, and what the risk is that then squeezes out other forms of public expenditure. For example, a Nordic model where you're investing much more in economic growth or younger people or enterprise or infrastructure so that you grow your economy to be able to support the society. So that's the happy stuff we talked about in terms of fairness. Now, at one level, I think you can see already where I'm coming from or going to, can't you? If that's what our report said in House of Lords-y language, so it's not too frightening, is it a surprise that the government took 6 months to respond, and when they did respond, that the response was, I think, a kind word would be pathetic, really. It was basically a collection of, a description of all the things that were going on, written by departments and stuck together. There were one or two bits that were new and good from Steve Webb in pensions, but by and large, they would admit privately that they had not been able to get behind it and address it. In a sense, we didn't want them to do anything apart from just to say, yes, we do recognise this as a big social issue, and we do recognise that it needs to be addressed, and we do recognise that it needs to have, as Bob Kerslake, the head of the civil service, said, we do need to have an honest conversation with the public about all of this. That's the sort of things officials say, and then they get smacked about the head by politicians, of course, because it's dangerous stuff. That's what we wanted them to do, to set out these issues clearly from government rather than the House of Lords, so that all of us as individuals, as society, as communities, as business, recognise this is a great social change, but it won't be a beneficial one unless all of us make some adjustments. And when I talked to the Cabinet Secretary about this, he was crisp, is a polite way of putting it again. He said, don't you realise the government's got two priorities, restoring the economy and getting back to fiscal balance? And I said, yes, but I think this is an issue you can't avoid. And when I talked to people, I won't quote them by name, but very senior ministers, they said, well, it's totally right, of course, but we can't do that sort of thing before an election because we'll be a hostage to fortune by the opposition party. And then, of course, one of the reasons they'd done so little was that this is an issue which doesn't have an owner. There's a lovely story, if you can bear with me. I went to see the Permanent Secretary of the Department of Health, that's anonymous, and she was charming, and I said, come to talk about the report, and she said, oh, yeah, very, very interesting report. Which department's coordinating the response to it? And I looked a bit blank and said, yours is. So you've got the point, haven't you, about the level of ownership of that as an issue in the system. In other words, there had not been any strong processes either at official level or at ministerial level. And we should worry, shouldn't we? I can have respect for politicians finding putting some of this stuff out into the public domain before an election quite tricky. But not to have done an analytic like that and have it on the shelf. That cost, I think, less than £200,000 to do. In public expenditure, it's utterly trivial not to have done it. And Charles will know, and Patricia will know, and Alan, why some of those things didn't happen. But that's not excusable. They haven't at least done the analytic of an issue which is an apparent and certain big social trend and got your head around it intellectually, even if ministers can't immediately handle it politically. The other reasons I was given as to why the response was so weak was, well, it's the coalition, isn't it? And which they meant by that everything is tradable. If you want a cup of coffee, I want a cup of tea. So, it's all quid pro quo at this stage of a difficult marriage, if I can put it like that. I think that's probably enough of the misery about why. Oh, the other stuff, of course, is that There aren't easy answers to it, and this is relevant to your exam question. They're questions that put the questions back to us. How am I going to accept my own responsibility for, working longer, saving more, keeping my skills up, being more employable, looking after my own health and well-being, because I can't expect the state or somebody else to do it all or fund it all. Not easy stuff. Now, Charles is a real politician and I'm not, but the last thing you want to do if you run up to an election is to start offering a set of really big problems and really big issues. The public do not wish to know. They want to think it's all going to get better. They want to think that there's a sort of a sunny upland coming along, a land of milk and honey. Or at least that's how politicians think of them. And so really starting at this point, when we've had a very difficult, 7 or 8 years, to saying, well, actually, there's some really big challenges coming. It's the last thing politicians want to be saying at this point in time. And the last point I've said already, the departmental silos. That's the bit I think that we put to Bob Kerslake, which departments have responded a bit to ageing. They've essentially responded because they're concerned about the fiscal implications for their own department, their own budgets, and they've thought about it for protectors rather than from the point of view of the public. So nowhere in the system have they thought about it the other way on. What's this going to mean if I'm a 30-year-old? What's it going to mean if I'm a 70-year-old? And given what are the challenges and experiences faced by people there, and how do we, in public policy terms, change what we do to support them better? They had not thought like that because they're in departmental silos, and they hadn't had process to do so. And of course, it also requires a leap of imagination to think that's where you should be thinking from there onwards, inwards, rather than from the historical position of the budgets and the power base and the policies. There we go. So what then, I've told you why it's been ignored, why there has not been a response so far. I've now not given up. We're banging away behind the scenes to people on manifestos. We're going around town telling every party the other parties are quite keen on this, and sometimes they believe you. And then we're also saying, well, a different story, which is it's going to hit you on the nose, as I was signalling, in a big way, because some of these fiscal implications are so significant. You can't just do it by tweaking a few bus passes or shrinking the scope of what's 100% free in the NHS. It requires you to think about the nature and the wider deal, the wider welfare settlement. And that's head-hurting and difficult stuff. The brighter ones like Letwin or David Laws will accept that, but obviously they don't want to go there in public. And so what I'm retailing, again, it just shows how young and naive I am, is that because they can't do it before the election, at least recognise that we ought to try to use some sort of process like the Turner Commission or the Dilnot Commission, whereby you've got bright people doing an arm's length look at a difficult subject, hopefully signed up to on a cross-party basis relatively rapidly. And we were served well by those two commissions. They did move the debate forward in an informal way. And I've been arguing we need something like this on the implications of ageing for our welfare settlement, and find 2 or 3 brilliant people to do that. An even bigger challenge. And they at least listened to me politely. We'll see whether that actually scores. In a sense, I've given an apologia, really. I've given an explanation as to why politicians find this difficult and why it's not surprising that they duck it. But I don't think that's good enough. I think we should seriously challenge at least the civil service system, that they haven't been able to do some of this work under the arras, irrespective. They ought to have been thinking about these issues, and it doesn't require much resource. But of course, the centre, in strategic terms, has been massively hollowed out in government. It's also, I think, too easy just to let politicians off the hook of saying they can't address these issues because they've got to get elected, and that's all that matters, and therefore they can't frighten the public. Present company, without mentioning names, there are examples of politicians who will talk truth to the public, even though it's a difficult truth. And that's what we should expect of our politicians, even though we would expect that that isn't going to be commonplace. And so on an issue like this, a really strong visionary politician would have wanted to set out at least some of these issues as an issue on which we haven't got an answer. We're not going to go into them now, but they're an issue for our society, and we think we've got to come back to it in ways that will address them. I think it's disappointing, to be polite, that that hasn't happened to date. Maybe it will, and I'll be pleasantly surprised. Charles.